Okay, let's dive right into this explainer where we're going to unpack an absolute ancient political thriller from Acts chapter 23. We're exploring a dramatic, highly illegal trial, a literal deadly street ambush, and some truly profound theological takeaways for believers today. It's a story packed with irony, extreme danger, and serious divine intervention, all centered right around the Apostle Paul. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We've got hypocrisy in the high court, the resurrection divide, God's providential presence, the deadly ambush plot, a midnight Roman rescue, and finally, principles for the believer. Let's get to it. Section 1. Hypocrisy in the high court. So let's start with a hook for our story. We find an innocent believer, Paul, standing trial before the Sanhedrin, which was the highest religious court in the land. And right out of the gate, the author exposes a really dangerous irony. These religious leaders, the exact guys tasked with upholding the law, are essentially acting like hardened criminals. This brilliantly illustrates the author's primary argument. This is at least the 6th time the Sanhedrin has formally gathered to evaluate the claims of Christ. We're talking everything from early reports about Jesus to Jesus' own trial, right through the trials of Peter, John, the 12, and Stephen. And you know what? In every single case, they deliberately hardened their hearts. Their concern wasn't investigating the actual truth of the resurrection. Nope, it was almost entirely about maintaining their strict control over the temple, the law, and honestly, the nation itself. Well, this obsession with control leads to an immediate abuse of power. Before Paul can even properly defend himself, literally just for stating he's lived with a clear conscience, the high priest, Ananias, illegally orders the guy standing near Paul to punch him right in the mouth. Naturally, Paul reacts indignantly and boldly calls him a whitewashed wall. Now, a whitewashed wall is something that looks fantastic on the outside, but it's inferior and rotting on the inside. It perfectly summarizes the absolute hypocrisy of a judge sitting there, pretending to try a man according to the law, while simultaneously commanding him to be struck completely contrary to the law. What's really fascinating here, though, is the historical context of Ananias. The Jewish high priesthood during Rome's occupation was incredibly political. Ananias wasn't some holy man. History tells us he was a despicable, wildly wealthy, and corrupt political appointee. The guy seized tithes from ordinary priests, handed out massive bribes, and used straight-up violence to get his way. Ironically, this pro-Roman leader would eventually be assassinated by his own people during the Jewish uprising against Rome in AD 66, which is just 9 years after this very trial. Crazy, right? Section 2. The resurrection divide. So, recognizing instantly that there was no way he'd get a fair trial in a court that flagrantly ignored the very laws it supposedly defended, Paul makes a brilliantly tactical move just to survive the hearing. Paul looks out at the council and notices it's a mixed crowd. So, what does he do? He shouts out that he's a Pharisee and that he's on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Talk about a game changer. This instantly fractured the jury along some really stark theological lines. You see, the Sadducees explicitly denied the resurrection, angels and spirits, but the Pharisees, they acknowledged all of them. So by throwing this fundamental theological controversy into the mix, Paul successfully divided his accusers, totally turning their hostility away from himself and right onto each other. The Pharisees suddenly stand up and start actually defending Paul. They're arguing, hey, maybe a spirit or an angel really did speak to him. Well, this emotional dispute between the religious leaders escalated so rapidly and got so intensely violent that the secular Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, literally feared Paul would be torn to pieces. It got so bad that the commander had to order his soldiers to physically pull Paul out of the room by force and drag him into protective custody in the barracks. Section 3. God's providential presence. We're going to slow our pacing down a bit here, because just when things look their absolute bleakest for Paul, he's locked in a cold Roman barracks, hated by his own countrymen, his fate entirely up in the air, the narrative shifts to this beautiful, quiet, intimate moment of divine reassurance. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and delivered this exact promise. Just imagine the absolute comfort of those words in that dark cell. Jesus personally vindicates Paul, assuring him that he's going to bear witness in Rome exactly as he had in Jerusalem. This deeply profound reassurance shifts Paul's entire posture. It really accounts for his calm, dignified bearing moving forward. It proves he's a man who is a master of events, rather than just a victim of them. So the absolutely crucial point is this. God's deliverance isn't always a miraculously opened prison door. Earlier in the book of Acts, we actually see angels opening physical jail doors for the apostles. But here, the dynamic changes. The divine power that rescues a believer from prison has instead become this powerful internal presence that enables the believer to patiently endure an imprisonment that, in Paul's case, is going to last for years. It's a really deep theological shift from expecting a sudden external rescue to relying on the internal fortitude provided by Christ. Section 4, the deadly ambush plot. Now, while Paul is experiencing this supernatural peace inside his cell, outside in the shadows of Jerusalem, a deadly conspiracy is rapidly brewing among the religious leaders. Because they flat out refuse to evaluate the claims of Christ fairly, they decide to resort to murder. Over 40 men bound themselves with a solemn, really dark oath, literally vowing not to eat or drink a single thing until they had assassinated Paul. Their master plan? Ask the Roman commander to bring Paul back down to the Sanhedrin for further inquiry, and then these assassins were going to murder him in the streets before he ever even arrived. Yet, as our author points out, God frequently hides his sovereign control in seemingly accidental, everyday events. In this case, God uses Paul's young nephew. The boy somehow overhears the plot, sneaks into the barracks, and warns Paul. Paul then utilizes his earthly rights, having a centurion take the boy to secretly warn the Roman commander, Claudius Lysias. It is just a perfect example of divine providence working quietly through completely ordinary human actions to thwart a massive conspiracy. Section 5, a midnight Roman rescue. Okay, let's move to the climax of this historical thriller. Let's see how this quiet little warning builds into an overwhelming, massive military response from the Romans just to protect one single man. When the Roman commander heard about the ambush, he wasn't taking any chances. No way. He deployed a staggering 470 soldiers. We're talking 200 infantrymen, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, all just to safely escort Paul out of Jerusalem down to Caesarea. And they made the move at 9 o'clock at night, entirely under the cover of darkness to ensure Paul's absolute safety. Along with this massive armed escort, Commander Lysias wrote a formal letter to Governor Felix. In it, he declared Paul completely innocent of any crimes deserving death or imprisonment, basically noting the whole dispute was merely over controversial questions about Jewish law. This establishes a huge recurring theme in Luke's historical documentation. Take a look. Every single Roman magistrate Paul faced, from Gallio to Lysias to Felix and later Festus, declared him 100% legally innocent of state crimes. So, Paul arrived safely in Caesarea, which marked the beginning of a 2-year imprisonment under Governor Antonius Felix. And Felix is a wildly fascinating historical figure himself. The Roman historian Tacitus actually noted that Felix was the first slave to ever become the governor of a Roman province. He famously wrote that Felix wielded the power of a king with all the base instincts of a slave. He was a notoriously harsh, ruthless ruler. Yet Paul being placed right under his jurisdiction was the exact fulfillment of God's sovereign plan for Paul to testify before kings and governors. Section 6, Principles for the Believer. Now, how exactly do we bridge this ancient, action-packed thriller to our modern faith? Well, let's synthesize the theological why behind all this history and look at the practical principles our source draws out for us today. The author uses the Sanhedrin's totally lawless, violent actions to provide this incredibly profound definition of idolatry. A lot of times, we think of idolatry as bowing down to golden statues, right? But here we see its true, subtle nature. The religious leaders were so terrified of losing their nation and their sanctuary that they flat out rejected their own Messiah just to protect their power. It's a stark reminder that whenever your priority is maintaining control over your life, your reputation, or your circumstances, rather than actually evaluating Christ's claims and submitting to God's will, your worship has essentially become idolatry. You've allowed something else to take God's rightful place on the throne of your heart. To clearly summarize the author's key takeaways here, keep these 3 things in mind. First, trust God's unseen hand. He constantly hides his sovereign control in everyday, seemingly coincidental events, like a nephew just happening to overhear a private conversation in a crowded city. Second, as believers, we should actively use the earthly privileges God provides, just exactly like Paul utilized his Roman citizenship and legal rights to survive. Trusting God definitely doesn't mean ignoring the practical tools he places right in front of you. And third, remember that divine power doesn't always remove the trial. More often than not, it provides the powerful, sustaining presence you need for patient endurance within that trial. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from today's explainer. When you look at the religious leaders back in Acts 23, their ultimate downfall was clinging so tightly to their own power that they completely missed what God was doing right in front of them. So take a second and examine your own heart today. Ask yourself honestly, who is really in control of your life? Are you fully submitting to God's will, or has your own desire for control secretly become your idol? Think on that for a bit, and we'll see you in the next explainer.